All right. Today, very last session of PDP for this term. And so we were saving the best for last. Sandra Matz, and some of you may already know her. She runs these fantastically popular sessions of negotiations here at CBS. And she is back again to facilitate our session today. Sandra, I'm not going to take any of the thunder away. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and take it away.
Very happy. Thank you so much for having me. I already learned that you have Peanut the cat. I have Milou the dog. She's kind of hanging out here. It's usually like, you know, when you start class, that's when she comes and she's whining. So we're gonna just have her hang out here. But it's really nice to be back. I think I've done this a couple of times now. And I hope that it's just a useful session, right? So you'll see that the way that I've structured it is kind of giving you some insights into the basics of negotiations, then having you run through an exercise to try and experience some of that yourself. We're going to debrief, we're going to talk about this, but it's really an appetizer in a way to what I think of actually much more as creative problem solving, by the way. I think we've titled this session Negotiations. That's kind of how we formally think about this, but I hope that you'll also see that many of the tools that I'm going to talk about, some of the frameworks that I'm going to use, I think are much more closely related to how do we solve problems together rather than trying to drag each other across the finish line. And so that's the plan for today. Let me just quickly pull up the slides. I joined CBS in 2017, so it's been a while now, and was coming from psychology and then got interested in computer science and business. So that's what brought me to Columbia. Let me share the screen here. And feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. Given that we only have 2 hours, I might just kind of jump in right away. But if there's any questions that come up as I go through some of the things, just feel free to unmute. I'm also going to pull up the pictures and the chat in case something happens there. Okay, you can all see the slides? Amazing. Okay, let's kick this off. Now, here's like one of the pictures that I love to show at the beginning of these classes is like, you don't get necessarily what you deserve in life, you get what you negotiate. And again, I think that the question, like, or this mantra of you don't get what you don't ask for, I think is very much embedded in how I think about negotiations. Now, one of the things that I want to clarify from the beginning, because I think people oftentimes have this perception of, well, you just have to be born an amazing negotiator. Negotiators are people who are extremely charismatic, they're really persuasive, they just manage to pull in people into their orbit. And we know from a lot of research that that's actually not true. And so obviously there's some people who feel more comfortable entering negotiations. Maybe they have like a little bit of an easier time getting the other side to open, getting the other side to make concessions. But we know that negotiations really can be learned. So many of the things that I'm going to talk about today are really not trying to change who you are as a person, right? I'm not in it to kind of make you a totally different person. What we're talking about is really thinking about how do you strategically think about what might be happening in negotiations, and then how do you adjust your behavior? Because most of what happens in negotiation is really just behavior, right? It depends on how do you prepare for a negotiation? What do you know about your side? What are the questions that they're going to ask? How do you open a negotiation? And how do you try and get concessions from the other side? Those are all behaviors and strategies that we can work on. And I think it's super important to keep this in mind is that you're not necessarily going to get better overnight, right? I'm not claiming that after 2 hours today, you're going to be a master negotiator. But what is super helpful, I think, about some of the things that we're going to talk about is that once you have the language to describe some of these things that might be happening in negotiations, and once you have some of these tools and strategies, you'll spot these in so many different contexts, right? There could be negotiating a gym membership, there could be negotiating rent. That applies, there could be negotiating with your kid whether they eat the broccoli or not. The negotiation, if you think about it like more broadly, is really everywhere in a way. And that's why I think going through some of these strategies is actually really helpful. Now, I would love to get a sense before we dive in, I would love to get a sense how you currently feel about negotiation, right? Like love and hate might be a little bit too extreme and like a little bit exaggerated, but I would love to hear from maybe first from people who like to negotiate, like, and what is it that you actually like about it? Anyone here who likes to, everyone's like, nah, Donald.
Hey, yes. So I've been trying to prioritize my schoolwork right now, and my boss called me earlier, and he was like, "Can you come in tonight?" And I was like, "No, I can't come in." And he was like, "Okay, okay, I get it." I was like, "Dude, I've had like 2 hours of sleep in the last 48 hours," and he was like, "Okay." He calls me back in like an hour, and I'm like, "So, I was like, well, is there going to be any bonus or incentive?" He was like, "I have nobody." And I was like, well, what can you offer? You know what I mean?
And what
So
did you
I negotiated. I mean, it was extra $50, but I'm already in overtime, so like I'm making quite a bit of money to come in the shift anyway. But I made a little extra money, you know.
And I think it kind of, it goes back to the point that I was making earlier, right? You don't get what you don't ask for. If you had thought, well, I'm just gonna do them a favor and I'm gonna come in, like you might have never seen those $50. So sometimes like part of negotiations is that it feels really nice to get something that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten, right? Most of the time when we enter negotiations, actually we get a better outcome. And that in and by itself can be extremely rewarding. Paul, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, the part that I enjoy about negotiations is the strategy component. So it's kind of like setting up your chess pieces for the end goal and basically being able to be fluid as far as what comes back at you. And you need to think on the spot rather than just have a prepared speech. So the strategy component makes it interesting.
Right. So to some extent, you can think of it as a challenge and almost like a game of strategy where you're trying to figure out, well, what is it that I actually want? What does it look like from the other side? And what might be the most effective moves to play in a certain situation? So it has a lot to do with reading the situation, maybe reading your counterpart, and then also kind of having a plan of, well, if they do that, here's what I'm going to do. So it's not just, as you said, it's not just you walk into the conversation just completely underprepared and you kind of try and do your best to charm them. A lot of it really has to do with preparation and trying to figure out, ideally before you even get to the table, well, who am I up against? What are we going to talk about? What are the difficult conversations that we're going to have? What are some of the things that I might be willing to give up to get something else in return, right? So there's a lot of strategy going on and that I think can be very enjoyable because it's essentially like a challenge to yourself. Anything else that people like about negotiations before we move over to the dark side? No, everybody else either feel, oh yeah, Eddie.
I can say something I like about negotiations is that they're empowering because you are actually playing an active role in, whatever the outcome is going to be in the situation.
Yeah. And I think that's totally true, right? Because to some extent, it kind of gives you agency. It gives you agency over the situation to say, well, you can change the outcomes that you're getting. And that's true both for yourself and also the other side. So oftentimes, and you'll see that this is coming up probably on the hate side, is that we oftentimes think of negotiations as, well, essentially everything that I get is being taken away from you and vice versa. So it's like this tug of war. And in this case, you at least get agency and control over your side. Now, what I would argue, and this is like as we move into the slightly different definition of negotiations, is that you also have a chance to take agency and kind of make other people better off, right? So it's not just that your outcomes that you're determining, but in a way, there's also room for you to say, well, if we engage in this creative problem solving, I can make myself better off, but maybe I can actually also make the other side better off. And that feels nice. There's actually pretty big gender differences in the extent to which people think of negotiations as something that is active and that they can have like control over. So there's like this really interesting study where they ask people, what do you associate with negotiations? And if you look at like most men say, well, it's like a challenge and it's a wrestling match. So it's like something that you actively have control over, right? Or it's like a chess game, so something that can also be quite fun. If you ask women, one of the most common answers is it's like going to the dentist. So that's not just a terrible experience, right? It's not just something that is like not generally super pleasant, but it's also something that just passively happens to you. So it's nothing where you can play an active role and you can in a way determine the outcome yourself, hopefully for the better. So this active involvement, and then again, like this idea of strategizing and getting a better outcome for yourself, I think are all components that make negotiations quite enjoyable. I want to hear from the other side. What are some of the components that you don't like about negotiations? What are some of the things that make it a lot more difficult to enter? Yeah, Rico. Also, if I mispronounce your name, please let me know. I have a talent for butchering.
I think for me, the thing that I hate is, especially coming from a business background, negotiation is where both sides feel like they have to get more from the other side instead of coming to a mutual agreement that's beneficial for both. There's this misconception that I have to get more than the other person in negotiation.
Right. So if you just look to Hollywood or you ask the person on the street, like, what is negotiations? Most of the time we think of it as a tug of war, right? Most of the time we're thinking about, well, I want to win and my gains come at your expense. So what I'm trying to do is essentially just maximize the piece of the pie that I get for myself. And that can create a lot of tension, right? If that's the mindset that you go into negotiation with, then everything becomes a fight. Then it's just like, well, I don't want to be screwed, so I better make sure that I screw you first before you can screw me. And that kind of completely makes the conversation, if we think about it in terms of creative problem solving, very difficult. Because if that's the mindset that you come in with, like, I'm not going to put any cards on the table, right? I'm not going to tell you anything that's important to me. And then vice versa, it's just like a concern that most people have in terms, because there's so much uncertainty in negotiations, right? You have a sense of, here's what it looks like from my side. You don't necessarily know what it looks like from the other side. And if you expect them to just be there to screw you over, then the entire experience becomes pretty hostile. Any other things that you don't like about negotiations? Yeah, Edward.
Yeah, I was gonna say like that feeling of like you're being sold to, like somebody's trying to sell something to you. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that.
It's like someone is trying to sell something to you, and you also never quite know if they're being honest, right? So I think the association that we have with salespeople is, well, they're not necessarily trying to sell me stuff in the way that's best for me. They're just going to try and maximize the money that they make from that sales. And they would tell me any story just to get me to buy that thing. And the same is true in negotiations. There's always this tension of, well, do we actually trust the other side? Do we think that they're telling the truth? How do we probe if they might be telling the truth or not? And a lot of it has to do with mindsets, right? Again, if you come in and you think it's a tug of war, chances that you're going to trust the other side are just much lower. And you're obviously right? Like there are some people who are going to try and eat your lunch. So it's not completely irrational to think that negotiations might be hostile and you might be taken advantage of. Any other things that you don't like? Yeah, Andrew.
Hey, how you doing? Maybe just not feeling confident in, my own position, even if I have the a reason to be. So I guess, making that first step and, getting into things and not feeling like I'm in the best position, even though I should be.
I think it's one of the most common concerns that people have, right? So even when people think that, well, maybe I can get a better outcome, the problem is it just makes us feel uncomfortable because it has this potential for, well, to what extent am I being taken advantage of? I don't want to take advantage of the other side necessarily, right? I don't want to be seen as too aggressive. I don't want to be seen as the person who is too entitled. So oftentimes people don't even start negotiations because they're worried about, like, what is the perception on the other side? And sometimes it has to do with power dynamics, right? So sometimes you might be the junior person coming in, negotiating with someone who's much more senior. So that oftentimes makes it harder. And for me, and hopefully you'll kind of agree with me by the end of the session, I think a lot of it has to do of how we think about negotiations and how we actually deal with negotiations. So I personally hated negotiations for exactly that reason. It just made me super uncomfortable. I remember when I got the job at Columbia, I didn't negotiate. And because I was like, this is like the fact that I'm going to get this job is amazing. It's like the best job I can imagine. Who am I to now try and get like a higher salary? And ironically, I think 2 weeks after I accepted the offer without negotiating, they told me that I was going to teach negotiations. So I'm like, well, did you realize what happened here? And this has totally changed my life. And because now I think about it totally differently. So now I think about, and you'll see this in the case that we're going to do today, the role play is that me getting something that is actually beneficial to me and me getting a good deal doesn't have to come at the expense of the other person. So oftentimes actually me engaging in a conversation allows me to figure out, well, what are the things that we actually care about, right? And how do we optimize this? If you think about it as a pie, how do we make this better for both of us? And for me, that has changed both how often I engage in negotiations and also how I approach these negotiations. Yeah, Ephraim. I think you have your hand up still. Ephraim, do you want to say something? If not, I'm going to move on.
I'm sorry, I was trying
Okay.
to. Yes. So I would say basically leaving money on the table, right? Like leaving money on the table is just like not getting the best deal, I would say. And also if you go into negotiations, a possibility I might lose the opportunity overall. Like you just said, you negotiate for your role in Colombia, right? And then it's just like, if you would have negotiated, would you still have gotten an opportunity? And sometimes like that's technically, yeah. And also it's just like, if they do say no, I don't want to feel bad about them saying no. And it's like, dag, like, and then now it's because awkward. I said no about getting extra pay or negotiating certain pay. And then now I'm looking at them funny, like, all right, they say no, and I still want to take this position after they say no. Like, it would kind of make it as an environment that's like unsettling.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is an awesome design. I don't know who did it, but it looks very nice.
It was probably like a 15-year-old. Or like no, I also really like it. That's why I put it there. But I think you're actually touching on like a lot of interesting pieces, because oftentimes, first of all, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So like what you said is like, you don't know how much you're leaving on the table. Like in your real world negotiations, you never get feedback. You might go through negotiation thinking you got an amazing deal, but actually the other side totally screwed you. Or you kind of might leave and saying like, oh my God, it's like so hard, but you actually got a great deal. So one of the reasons for why these exercises like the one that we do today are actually really, really helpful is that you can turn the cards over, right? So you go through this exercise, and then after, we're just going to look at, well, what does it actually look like from both sides? So you get feedback both on the outcomes and also like on perception. So I'm going to put you back in your teams once we've discussed some of this, and then you can give each other feedback and say, well, you came in way too aggressive. I was just going to walk out like the minute that you opened, right? So like that's one of the fears that we oftentimes have that you mentioned is like, well, if the other side thinks that we're so entitled and super aggressive, they might just say, no, thank you. So we have like these worries about what does it do? Maybe we can get like some additional money, but what does it do to the relationship? Maybe they think I'm a jerk. They don't want to work with me. Or maybe I'm not going to get what I want, and then I don't feel comfortable working with this employer anymore. So we're going to talk about some of these dynamics. And that's really the benefit that you get from going through some of these exercises, is that you just kind of turn the cards over and remove some of that uncertainty and ambiguity. Peter.
Yeah, I just I think about I went to a yard sale a couple of months ago, and this guy it was almost like he was sitting in a junkyard. It was a lot of the stuff was just like really, really just garbage. And I didn't want to spend more than $20. There was a little statue that I wanted. So I took the statue up to the guy and I said, okay, how much do you want for this? And he said, oh, $200, those are going for a lot of money these days, these types of statues. And I'm like, I was just, in my mind, I was going like, this is the best offer you're going to get today and probably ever. This is going to end up like going in the garbage. But I didn't say that. I said, well, how about $20? Is that okay? And I was very polite and everything. But the moral of the story is I ended up walking away because I didn't even really, it wasn't even worth 20. It was worth like 0. But he came from even though he was sitting in a junkyard, he was coming from a position of strength, and he held steady at that $200.
Yeah.
So the psychology of it is very interesting.
And I think you're absolutely right? So one of the decisions that we have to make in negotiations is how extreme do we want to be in our first offer, right? So first offers actually make a huge difference, because if you come in too low, you can't hit the reset button, right? The moment that you say the seller says, well, I'm happy to sell it for 10, even though you were willing to spend 20, you can't just say, well, now that I understand that you would be willing to pay more, let's just go back and do this again. So there's this constant tension of how can you still be ambitious, but not too extreme, right? Because the problem with too extreme is that people might just walk away. If he says 200, you're like, well, this is so far off, we don't even need to continue the conversation. So one of the pieces of advice, when you kind of think about, like, how can I be ambitious in the way that I make first offers, but not too extreme, that's in a way that's killing the deal, is always thinking about, well, if the other side now asks me why I think this is a fair price, can I reasonably justify it? Right? If you ask me now, why do you think that $200 is fair? And the guy has an amazing answer, has a certificate, whatever it is, maybe that's fine. In the absence of that, you lose trust, right? So the moment someone comes in and it feels completely unreasonable, they don't have a good explanation, that's probably too extreme. So this is like a rule of thumb that I really like is, if someone asks me like why I think this is a fair price, can I still justify it? And if the answer is yes, I can, then it's probably okay to be that ambitious. If the answer is like, no, I have absolutely no good reason for why I'm asking for that much, then it might be too extreme. So I think that the openings really, really matter. Sandra, and then we're moving on to the exercise.
Yeah, my stepfather taught me a few things about negotiation that have really served me well, especially when it comes to purchasing something. Being prepared to walk away, just having that in your mind, like, this is something I'm prepared to walk away from. Don't even have to make direct comments that are indicating this is like, it's take it or leave it. But it has worked so well in getting me great prices for cars. And then this summer, it was kind of the other way around. I was selling a car. It is a 1996 Honda Civic, like barely had 100,000 miles on it. And I had like a stack of documentation for the care of this vehicle over its entire lifespan. So I knew that asking for $6,000 for this car was a fair price.
Yeah.
And I got so many guys calling me up, and I'm sorry guys, but it's usually guys that are trying to tell me like, oh, the transmission's slipping. I'm like, go a little faster, you're in third gear, and to wait and to be patient, because, I knew that I had something of value and I was able to back it up. So all I had to do was wait for the right buyer to come along, which they did.
And I think like a couple of super important lessons, right? One is that essentially a lot of it has to do with alternatives. So like this, what we call in negotiations, best alternative to negotiated agreement, or BATNA. So you might have heard of this term. And so the moment that you actually have alternatives, that gives you a ton of power in the negotiation, right? So the same way that you were saying, well, there were like 10 other people who were interested in a car, and I knew exactly how much this thing is worth, and I could justify it. That puts you in a much better spot than kind of being in a position where the person that you're talking to is the only person interested in it. It's oftentimes what makes these job negotiations so hard, right? So the reason, kind of coming back to Ephraim's point, why we're oftentimes so worried about coming across as too aggressive and coming across as too entitled is if that's the only option that we have, if we only have like one job that we're negotiating over, well, losing that puts us in a terrible spot because there's just no safety net, right? So the moment that you actually have alternatives that you've created, then you can become a lot more confident. And it doesn't mean that you have to bring those alternatives up, right? So I'm not saying that in a job negotiation, you should go in and be like, hey, I have like these 5 other jobs, or like I have these 5 other people who want to buy the car, or these 5 other people who are interested in renting my place. even just knowing that that's the case, right? Even just knowing that if this person on the other side is trying to screw me over, I'm very happy to walk out. That just kind of gives you a lot of power in negotiation. So a general rule of thumb, most people say it's actually the biggest source of power that you have. Like if you can, it's not always possible, right? If I only have one job, that's what I have to deal with. But to the extent that you can, creating those alternatives for yourself and having a plan B, having a backup plan, actually kind of means that you can be a lot more ambitious in what you ask for. Yeah, Donald.
I think one of the best negotiation tactics I've ever seen was the other day I was in the pawn shop, right? And I was looking at some rings, and I was trying to find some like gold coins, and I didn't find any, but there was a gentleman that walked in, and he was asking about these watches, you know, these Rolexes, right? And he was asking like what year they were, and he only wanted this certain year, like before 19, I think it was like 80, anything before 1980 is what he was looking for, you know? And he didn't find it. And then he was like, what about these cufflinks over here? I came in here the other day, and you know, the salesman try to you know, get me for $250 on these, man. And and the other salesman was like, yeah, that's about right for this, you know, they're marked at this, and that he was like kind of right on the money. And the guy was like, you know, he's like, he just sat there for a minute. You could tell he was thinking. He was like, I'm gonna pass. He was like, the most I could do is 225. And then the guy was like, no. He was like, okay. And he just turns around, heads for the door. Like he's beelining for the door. You know what I mean? And then the salesman's like, you know what? I could do that. I could do that. Yes, I could do that. And I was just like, my mouth just dropped. Like I was like, man, I wish I could be that confident in like negotiating price or sales. Like he just did like a bait and switch on this guy, or I don't know what you call it, but it was like really good.
It's like a very common strategy, right? You essentially kind of like if you think about car sales, man, it's just kind of you walk out and it's like, okay, and then they call you back. Now, sometimes it works. The big risk that you have with these strategies, which is in a way is like a take it or leave it, or I'm going to walk out on you if you don't match my price or whatever it is that might just be the end of the conversation, right? So if you set a walk away point, which is what we call it, you have to be prepared to walk. Because if now you're playing games, right? If you say, well, I'm going to walk out the door at 225, and now the salesman doesn't call you back, and like 2 minutes after you come back and say, you know what, I reconsidered, now you're in a much bigger position, right? So like this walking out can be extremely powerful because it signals to the other side that, well, either like the conversation is over or you kind of match my price, but you really want to be prepared. You really want to make sure that you're happy to walk out, right? It's sometimes, if it's just a strategy, you might lose credibility by coming back. So yeah, sometimes that works. Okay, so just kind of positioning us in the context of this exercise, I think this has come out from many of the comments, is that there's something that can be fun about negotiations. It's something that can be rewarding, right? If you get like something that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten. But it oftentimes, even if we do get a better outcome, it just makes us feel uncomfortable because there's uncertainty. We don't want to offend the other side. We don't want to be taken advantage of. And a lot of this, I think, has to do with this conceptualization of negotiations as this, what we think of like zero-sum game, was like everything that I get is taken away from you and vice versa. So it's really kind of this question of there's a pie sitting on a table. How do we slice it? If I get a bigger piece, you get a smaller piece. So that's the traditional conceptualization or like idea that people have when we think about negotiations. And sometimes that's true, right? If you think about the pawn shop, there's only like money you can only slice in so many different ways, right? If you get $10 more, the other side gets $10 less. But most negotiations aren't just a zero-sum game, right? So there's very few instances where the only thing that you negotiate over is price. Most cases, when you talk about your lease, when you talk about jobs, there's so many other things that you can talk about that it makes it a lot easier to shuffle value around, right? And say, well, maybe I'm going to give you something here but I want something else in return. What I should say is, by the way, the pawn shop made me think of this. There's this TV series called Pawn Stars, which is terrible trap, by the way, for non-native speakers. I use this in my class, and I think the first year I mentioned this, I just mispronounced it, and it was like a disaster. So I'm very careful every time I bring this up. But there's actually so much you can learn from these episodes. It's amazing because oftentimes, like, again, people come in and they're all professional deal makers, and you see a ton of mistakes. I think it's the best lesson oftentimes for how not to negotiate, because the pawn stars just kill the people coming in. Back to this one here. So what I want to do in this exercise is essentially kind of start thinking about negotiations a little bit broader. So not just in terms of haggling, right? It's not just how do I get a great price on an item and someone else gets a worse price, but thinking of negotiations broader in the terms of creative problem solving. So we're going to do an exercise, and I'm going to post the link in the chat in a second. It takes about 35 minutes. And it's a case that I picked because most of us like have a sense of like how some of these negotiations unfold. Some of you might be in the position like this right now. And so job offer, you already have a job, you got the offer, and now you're just negotiating the terms. So in this case, Roberts is in the final stage of negotiating employment with Gordon. It takes about maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes to prepare, and then 20 minutes to negotiate. So we're gonna put you into breakout rooms of 2 people. First thing you need to do is figure out who plays which role, right? So one of you needs to be the employer, Gordon. One of you needs to be the job candidate. If you both read the same materials, guarantee you the negotiation is not going to be very fun. So make sure you know which materials you're reading which role you're playing before you start reading the materials. And then really kind of think of it as an exercise where you take on the preferences, right? It's going to tell you, here's how much you care about this, here's how much you care about that. The more you internalize those preferences, the more interesting the conversation is going to be. So let me just get the links to the materials. Here. Before we send you off into breakout rooms. And then what's going to happen is, so you kind of go through this exercise. And then once you've done this, we're essentially going to come back. I'm going to say a little bit more about how we can think about these negotiations more broadly. What are some of the concepts, some of the things, and ways in which we can think about these negotiations. And then I'm going to put you back into groups if we have time. So you're going to reconnect with your counterpart once we've seen all the cards, and you can debrief again and say, well, here's actually what this looked like from my side, and so on. So try not to debrief with your counterpart just yet. I'm going to give you some extra time later on. Just quick check. Does the Dropbox link work in the chat? Perfect. So you can, there's like, should be 2 materials or 2 documents. One is Gordon, one is Roberts. Amazing. Okay. Then if we could open the breakout rooms and just set them for 35 minutes, I'm going to send you off to negotiate, and then we're going to regroup and discuss what happened, what was successful, what was not successful. Make sense? Any questions? Awesome.
All right, everyone. So I've set up the breakout rooms, and I think today you're all automatically assigned to the room, and you are set up in pairs. So if you've any questions once you're in the room, just ping me or Sandra, and one of us can come in and answer any questions that you have.
Amazing. Have fun. And it's an even number.
Yes, we lucked out. It's an even number.
Otherwise, someone has to observe. Otherwise, it's like a group of... You still look happy. That's a good sign. Most people are smiling. There's no one who's like, I'm out of here. This was the most horrible experience ever. So that's looking good. Let me get my slides back. So what we're going to do, first of all, I hope you enjoyed the experience. I know that sometimes kind of going through these role plays can feel a little bit artificial. But as I said, I think it's super helpful just because it now allows us to turn those cards over. So what I'm going to do is, once I pull up the slides, I'll essentially want to talk a little bit about some of these frameworks that we have for negotiations, and especially negotiating some of these more complex deals, right? So in this case, there were like multiple issues that you talked about. It wasn't just like price. And it's really helpful to have this language to think through negotiations, right? Because like once you have a concept, it's very easy to recognize. It's very easy to think through, well, this might be happening in the next negotiation as well, and now I know how to deal with it. So let me quickly pull up the slides again. Okay, everybody can see the slides? That's perfect. The breakout rooms here and the chat open. Okay. So essentially the conversation that we're having, and I think that's again what makes negotiations a lot more fun than just like the typical heckling in the market or what you see in Hollywood movies, is that most of the time we think of this question as like, well, there's a pie, how do we slice in? And really in this case that you just negotiated, and most negotiations, I would argue, that we have in the real world, the question is much more like, how do we actually grow the pie, right? How do we create value for both of us in a way that kind of resembles creative problem solving a lot more than just tug of war and trying to screw the other side. So what I want to talk about is essentially what I think of as the issue mix. So we're going to talk about the specifics of the case in just a second, but I want to talk about some of these broader types of issues that might be present in negotiations. And I think of it as a diagnostic tool, right? So ideally, before you get to the table or once you're in the conversation, you want to figure out, well, what are the things that I'm dealing with here, right? Is this a topic that is going to be difficult because we want exactly the opposite things? Is it something where our interests might be aligned? Or is it something where we might feel differently, but not to the same extent? And the reason for why it's super helpful to have an understanding of like what types of issues might be present in negotiation is, as you'll see, that they all have their own unique advantages and challenges. So understanding what you're dealing with will then allow you to say, okay, here's the kind of back to who made that comment, Paul. I think you made the comments like, once you have this understanding of like, what does a chessboard look like, right? You can start strategically arranging, but for that, you need to know what's the game we're playing and what are the players that are involved. So I'm going to go through one by one and always give you an example, and then we can relate it back to the case that you did. So distributive issues is essentially those issues that resemble pretty much a tug of war. And I think of this as like a slope. So I think of this as how much do you get, right? So that's your outcome. And how much does your counterpart get? So the higher, the better in terms of value. If we think about this, distributive issues have a perfectly negative slope. So everything that I get gets taken away from you and vice versa, right? So those are the types of issues that we have to fight over. Most of the time when money is involved, it's a distributive issue, right? It's very hard to have the same $100 in both of our pockets. That's just like the nature of money. Sometimes you can reshuffle it a little bit by thinking about when do you pay and so on and so forth. But most of the time, when money is involved, it's going to be a conversation that has a lot more friction, right? Because essentially, it's like we can't have the same money in both of our pockets. The second type of issue is the exact opposite. It's what we call compatible issues. So essentially, it's these types of issues where you and your counterpart want the same thing. So that could be, for example, in the context of job negotiations, is that you want to continue your education and want to get professional development, and your employer wants to do the same, right? So you want to get better at your job, and your employer also wants you to be better at your job. It's oftentimes much easier to get an employer to put money towards, again, development and professional development than towards your salary, because they see an upside and you see an upside. Now, question to you, why do you think we talk about these compatible issues? On some level, you could argue, it's just nice, right? If we figure out that we want the same thing, amazing, why don't we just move on? Why do you think it's actually helpful to potentially think about whether something might be a compatible issue where you both want the same thing, even though it just feels like a good feel good, sunshines and unicorn type of issue? Why is it important? Yeah, Sandra.
Well, my negotiation, I learned right away that my counterpart wanted Boston. And so my approach from there was kind of exploit that a little bit, as far as maybe make him think that maybe Boston isn't where I want to send him, but I will if we get concessions elsewhere.
Yeah. So, I mean, like James puts in the chat, happy workers are productive, right? So some people say, well, it's amazing to build rapport. Like if we figure out that we want the same thing, it's a great starting point. It's amazing to make the other side happy. It's something that we should highlight, right? Because like we're essentially making a concession and it's nice. Now, these feel-good issues, and this is like what Sandra was describing just now, they actually lend themselves to a little bit of deception, right? And the reason, so they can quickly turn into issues that are not so feel-good, if you want. And that's because if I figure out what you want, and I realize, well, we want the same thing, I don't necessarily have to tell you, right? If I figure out you want to go to Boston, I want you to go to Boston too, I don't necessarily have to tell you. Maybe I'm like, sending you to Boston, it's going to be a little bit hard. I can do it, but then you need to come down with salary, or I need like to get a bigger salary depending on which role you play. So these feel good, and so what we call sandbagging, and like these feigned concessions, it's essentially, the word goes back to, I think like 150 years, 200 years ago in New York, when people would be mugged, not with knives and guns, but actually sandbags. So the idea is you hit someone over the head and you victimize them without potentially leaving a trace, right? Because if Sandra's strategy works out, she might have gotten a concession somewhere. She might have gotten something on a different type of issue without the other side necessarily noticing that she just pretended that she didn't want Boston and then gave in. So sandbagging essentially is, you both want the same thing, that's the reality, but you don't know what these cards look like, right? So the other side doesn't know what if Sandra actually wants to go to Boston or not. So you pretend that you kind of want something else, right? If your counterpart says Boston, you're like, Boston is going to be hard, I can do it, but only if I get something somewhere else, right? So you pretend that you have a preference that you don't have. And I'm going to give you an example in just a second for like how this might play out in the real world. Now, if it works, right? So Sandra, in your case, it might have been like the other side says, okay, if you do Boston for me, I'm going to give you something somewhere else. It can be like a super quick win, but there's also like a pretty big risk. And I'm going to show you this with an example. So let's say my husband and I, it's the weekend and we decide we want to watch a movie and we want to have drinks. And very stereotypically, he wants to watch RoboCop and he wants cocktails. Now, what I really want is I want to watch Love Actually, just a stereotypical, and I also want cocktails. So that's my real preference. That's what I really want. But what I tell him is like, look, honey, I want to watch Love Actually, and tonight I feel like having a glass of wine. But now here comes the fake concession. But because I love you so much, I'm happy to make this concession on the drinks. Fine. If we watch Love Actually, then we can go with your cocktails. Now, in an ideal world, I get everything I want, right? So I get the movie that I want and I get the drinks that I want. And my husband still feels like I'm a very nice person and I've made a concession. Now, what's the risk of the strategy? What's the risk of actually pretending that you have a preference that you don't have, just to kind of try and get a concession somewhere else? What's the worst case scenario for me in this case? Yeah, Ephraim.
Your husband finds out your alternative motive and knows that, and finds out that you are manipulative.
It's like divorce is what you're saying. So we might just get divorced if he figures out that I'm lying. Because what could happen is that he essentially says, well, honey, that's so nice of you to come my way in terms of the drinks, but how about we do it the reverse? How about you get the drinks that you want, right? I told him I want wine. So he's like, well, how about you get the wine? Now I picked a movie. So the worst case scenario, right? Best case scenario, you get everything that you want. And like the other side thinks that you're really nice. Worst case is that they take you at face value. And now they're trying to solve a problem that you don't even have, right? If like the other side says, well, you want me to go to Philadelphia? okay, fine, I can try to make this happen, but now you have to give me something else in return. So I'm not telling you never use sandbagging. That's up to you, right? So it's a little bit up to you how you want to play the game, but I do want you to be aware of the risk. So it might feel like you get this quick concession, but the risk that you're running into is if you're pretending to have a preference or you want something that's not actually true, and the other side is playing fair, right? So the other side, in this case, my husband could actually try to say, well, I'm going to give you the drinks. And now I'm in a really shitty position because now I either lose credibility, right? Now I either have to tell him, you know, when I said I want wine, not really what I meant, risk a divorce, or I now have to suffer through Robocop with like something that's probably stronger than wine. So just be aware that compatible issues, they might feel like these feel-good issues, they do lend themselves to deception. And I want you to be just very clear of, is that a risk that you're willing to take? Then go for it. And also, like, does it correspond to the ethics that you have in mind when you negotiate? But also there's a pretty big risk of like not essentially you ending up in a position where you don't get any of the things that matter to you. Now, how is the juice worth the squeeze? Yeah. And so the last type of issue is the one that I personally think is the most interesting one. And that's really where the best negotiators focus on. So it's what we call integrative issues. It's not, we don't necessarily want the same thing, but the extent to which we care about these different issues might vary, right? So you could imagine that, again, coming back to a job negotiation, there might be two different issues. One is how soon do you start and how much vacation do you get? And it could be, we don't necessarily have to agree. So it could be that I want to start later, you want me to start sooner, I want more vacation time, obviously, you want me to have less. Now, what a lot of negotiators do if they don't have as much experience is they say, well, there's 5 issues on the table. That's complicated. Let's simplify it and let's just go through issue one by one. Let's kind of pick start date first, negotiate that, and then move on to vacation time. What happens if you do that, if you do it one by one, is you turn every single issue into a tug of war and a distributed issue, right? So let's say Sandra and I, the two Sandras, are negotiating, and then I would just say like, okay, let's just focus on start date. And I say, well, I want to start later. And you say, well, I want you to start sooner. And I say, well, no, later. And you say sooner. We kind of do this back and forth. And at some point we're like, okay, fine. We're not getting anywhere. Let's just split the difference. Let's meet in the middle and just kind of both make a concession. Okay, nobody's really happy. Moving on to the next one. And we do the same tug of war again for vacation time, right? So now I have to say, well, I want more. You say no less. I would say more. You say less. And at some point, we again do the same thing. We split the difference and we meet in the middle. Now, this has like some notion of fairness, right? Because we're both making concessions. We're both giving something up, but it's not the ideal outcome. Because if you think about it, now I get half of something that I don't really care that much about, right? If I push you to start later, to have me start later, yeah, that's like nice for me, but it's not giving me the world. It just makes me feel a little bit better. But I also only get half of something that I really, really care about. And this, in this case, is vacation time, right? So instead of saying, well, we just go through issue one by one and we split the difference somewhere in the middle, what you can do is what we think of as trading on priorities. So which means that I give you a lot on the things that you really care about, right? If Sandra cares about me starting sooner a lot and I can figure this out, I can say, okay, look, I can maybe start sooner. It's not what I want, but I can do this if, and now you have to make it conditional, if you can give me a lot more vacation days, right? So now Sandra gets a lot of the stuff that she really cares about, and I get a lot of the stuff that I really care about. And we're making concessions on the things that don't really matter as much. So it's what we call essentially this like trading on priorities, right? The easiest way for me personally to think about the idea behind it is to think about the flip side. If you think about the world's most stupid concession that you can make is like giving up something that matters a lot to you and doesn't create much value for the other side, right? If I give up something that's super important to me, but doesn't make the other side happy, I've essentially lost everything. So trading on priorities is essentially this obsession of trying to figure out what matters to the other side, what matters to my counterpart, and how can I give it to them cheaply, right? If there is something that means the world to them and it creates a ton of value, it's not that you're giving it to them because you're a nice person necessarily and because you want to be charitable. You're giving it to them because you're now in a very good position to ask for something else in return. So again, Sandra cares about me starting sooner. I can say, look, it's hurting my bottom line. I'm willing to do it if you give me something else in return. And that's really how most of the value in negotiations is being created. And I'm going to show you in a second what this looks like in the case. And the reason for why we oftentimes don't do this is because we're so worried that we're going to get screwed by the other side, right? It's very hard to make these concessions and say, look, I'm willing to give up something. So you really want to make it conditional on you getting something that's important to you. That's the entire idea. If you take one thing away from these 2 hours, is that you can make negotiations, first of all, a lot more fun, because now it becomes about how do we solve the problem, right? How do we solve the puzzle? How do I make sure that you get what you want? And how do I make sure that I get what I want? And that doesn't mean that we agree all the time, right? There could be things where both of us say, no, it's so important that I'm not willing to give it up. And that's like something that you have to figure out. But if there is something that you know doesn't cost too much and it's not super important to you, that might be a good starting point to give to the other side. And it's the difference between compromising and integrating, right? So compromising is in a way relatively mindless. It's just saying like, okay, we want different things. Let's just kind of split the difference, meet somewhere in the middle, move on. Integrating is a lot more creative because it's trying to shuffle around value. It's trying to see how can I give you the stuff that matters to you and then in return get the things that matter to me. Let's talk about what this looks like in the context of the case that you've just negotiated. And so there were like many different things on the table that you talked about. I want to start with the distributive issues. So what were the issues? And you can either unmute or post it on the chat. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to read the chat. Too hard for me to do this in real time. But what were some of the issues that you really had to fight over? What were some of the issues where you felt, look, this is probably a negative slope. We're just we both don't want to budge. We both don't want to make concessions. Yeah, Donald.
One of the issues that I really had to try to negotiate was the vacation time, but I allocated that with getting what I really wanted. What I really wanted was to go to Boston, work in retail, and what I really wanted also was like the medium salary, which was 95. So I shot for 100,000. I got the 95, and then but it was really hard to get this because at first I was like, well, I need 15 vacation days, and then I settled at 10 days. And I was all about, the wife and the kids, I'm going to be putting all this time and,
So you try to provide a rationale. And
yeah.
It's interesting. So some of the things that you have to fight over, right, are essentially the distributive ones where essentially your loss is their gain and vice versa. Some of the things that you have to fight over are also the ones that they care a lot about. So vacation time is actually one of the ones where your counterpart might have cared a lot more about. So that's why they kind of probably push back really hard on vacation time. Any guesses on what did I say about distributive issues? Whenever dollar signs are involved, that's oftentimes a distributive issue. So distributive issue, salary, right? So salary, any kind of money that the employer puts into my salary is taken from the employer directly and vice versa. Now, to all of the Globals and Gordons, what was more important to Roberts than to you? So that's probably the flip side of Donald. What did you feel like Roberts really wasn't going to budge on? What is something that Roberts pushed back on really hard when you tried to get more of? What was like a priority of Roberts in this case? Yeah, Paul.
The health insurance.
Yes, healthcare. So healthcare was important to Roberts. Anyone figure out why?
No, not until afterwards.
So you did the debrief already.
Yeah.
So tell us why. Why was healthcare important to Roberts?
He was basically dealing with a chronic issue. So having access to top tier facilities countrywide was pretty important.
Right. So it's one of the cases where actually dollar amounts has different values. So if the employer puts better puts more money towards better health insurance, that's going to save Roberts a lot of costs further down the road. Because if they don't have good health insurance, they just have to pay everything out of pocket. So in this case, health insurance was something that really mattered to Roberts. And yes, obviously the employer wants to pay less, but it wasn't as important, right? So the points that Roberts got for a good healthcare plan was much more than the points that were subtracted from Gordon in that case. All of the Roberts, and Donald already kicked us off. Vacation time seemed to be something that was important to Gordon. Anything else that was important to Gordon in this case that you felt like, well, we don't want the same thing, but Gordon's really not budging on this issue. If you think about integrative issues, what was important to Gordon other than vacation days? Yeah, Andrew.
Well, I was Robert, but it was something that I found out in debrief that while Robert had said that he was definitely against Chicago, he would have been okay with New York or San Francisco, but he really wanted Boston. But then found out that also from Gordon's point of view that he also wanted Boston. And that was the same thing for one of the others as well. So I thought that was, an interesting part of the exercise is that we were both looking for the same thing.
Yeah. So this is like one of the compatible issues, right? And it doesn't necessarily play out that well that way in negotiations, right? So you might have both wanted the same thing, but your counterpart is just pretending they want something else to get the concession. So some people, like when we now turn the cards over, is like, well, I didn't know that this was an issue where we wanted the same thing. It felt like they actually pushed back pretty hard just to get something else out of this. Anything else that was more important to Gordon? Yeah, James. Oh, and Don.
For me, it was I tried to butt up against like even lowering down 20% on the moving cost.
Yes. So moving expenses, right? So moving expenses was more important to Gordon, and I'm going to show you the points in just a second. So again, like just having an understanding of like what are some of the dynamics of the case, right? Salary, it's really hard because you want the opposite thing. And then there are like some things where you can shuffle value. Donald, you have your hand up. Is that a question or is that from before? From before?
That's actually from before. I'm sorry, I didn't lower it.
No worries at all. Like I've been there so many times. Okay.
But I was gonna say that like I actually did it. I must have just went right over the healthcare part for Gordon. And I did it more personally. Like I was like, I go to Mexico for a lot of my stuff like dental and stuff like that. So I was like, I'm not worried about the healthcare, but then I realized that, I didn't read that part. My bad.
So you were Roberts or you were Roberts or Gordon?
No, I was
Employer or employee?
I was an employee.
Okay, so you knew essentially like how many points you got for, because like the employer doesn't know, right? So, and now again, like we're turning those cards over. So you know your side. So okay, here's like something where I get a lot of points. You don't necessarily know what it looks like from the other side. So in this case, salary is one of these distributive issues, right? So every step that you go down or up kind of creates value of the same amount to the other side. So if Gordon makes the concessions from 58 to 90, they lose 1,000 points, but Robert gains the same 1,000. So it's like a perfectly negative slope. So that's something that you probably have to fight over, right? So there's only so much value that you can shuffle around. Now, healthcare, again, it's not a positive slope. You don't want the same thing. It's somewhat negative, but it's lopsided, right? It's like one of these things where if you give everything to Roberts, they actually get 4,000 points, whereas if you were to give everything to Gordon, they only get 2,000 points. So you don't want the same thing, but Roberts cares a lot more about healthcare than Gordon in this case, because they get a lot more points if they get everything that they want. Now, the opposite is true for moving expenses and vacation time, right? So again, here, you don't want the same thing, but if you give everything to Gordon, they get 2,000 points in each versus Roberts, who only gets 2,000 in total if you give them everything that they want. So this is essentially where you can trade on priorities. And I'm going to show you in a second of what this might look like. So saying as like, if you say, well, okay, I understand Roberts, healthcare seems to be really important to you. Let's make sure I'm going to give you the best plan that I can. You get 4,000 points. for me to do this, it's essentially it just means that it's a big loss because I get nothing. For me to do this, I need something else. And what you want to ask for is essentially, okay, I want a good deal on moving expenses and I want a good deal on vacation time, because that's how you regain the value on the things that you lost in healthcare. And then you have these compatible issues, which both of you want to be in Boston, and then job assignment, both want to be in retail. And again, some people come in and say, well, you want Boston, I want Boston, amazing. It's like a great starting point. Let's just kind of move on and use it to build rapport. Other people might have sandbagged. Now, here's one of these opportunities for actually sandbagging backfiring. Because you could imagine, for example, when it comes to location, like Gordon might say, I want you to work in Boston. And now Roberts might try to sandbag. So Roberts might say, well, you know what? Boston, not really my favorite option. I'd much rather be in Philadelphia. Now, in that case, Gordon might say, fine, let's move you to Philadelphia because it gives exactly the same points to Gordon, right? So Gordon doesn't care if Roberts goes to Philadelphia or Boston. They get 3,200 points in each of the cases. Now, if that's the card that Roberts playing, like they have to find a way of coming back, right? So if Gordon says, okay, that's fine, let me kind of send you to Philadelphia. Now you either have to say, actually, that changed my mind. I do want to go to Boston now that I think about it. Or you're just kind of, this is really burning money, right? If you think about the fact that you could kind of claim value for both wanting the same thing, you misrepresent, the other side takes you at face value, you've just kind of burned a lot of value and money on the table. Here's the difference, and this is again now applied to the case that you did. Here's the difference between compromising, so this idea we just split the difference, and integrating. So here's a deal where I essentially structured, like I just gave the half, like somewhere half on salary. I just assumed that you figured out the compatible issues. But what I do is I essentially say on the integrative issues, so that's healthcare, moving expenses, and vacation time. You don't want the same thing, but you care about these things differently. If you just say, okay, we're just going to give you a mediocre healthcare plan, not the best, not the worst. We're going to do something moving expenses in the middle, and then vacation time we're also going to meet in the middle. Has this notion of fairness, right? Because both of us are making concessions, but the points that you get as Gordon and Roberts is essentially 7,400 with a joint pie. So that's how I think about this entire pie of 14,800. If you structure the deal differently, if you say, instead of compromising, I'm going to try and figure out what's important to Roberts. So I'm going to give the best healthcare plan to Roberts, and I'm going to get everything, like I pay the least amount of moving expenses and give the least amount of vacation days, which is like what matters to Gordon. You can see that actually both sides are better off, right? So by making it, oftentimes we think of like, well, we make a concession and we lose money or the value, whatever that value is. Not necessarily true. Like if you do these smart trades, right? If you're smart in saying, I'm giving you something that hurts me a little, but gives a lot of value to you, and I'm in return going to get something that means a lot to me, most of the time, both sides are actually better off, right? So you see that the joint value is like these 21,600. It's much bigger than the initial one. And actually both sides are better off. So that's why I now think of negotiations very differently, right? Initially, I was worried that if I kind of ask for the stuff that I want, I'm going to necessarily hurt the other side. It's not really true. If I find ways in which I can try and understand, well, what matters to the other side and can I solve their problems cheaply, I can make myself better off, as in this case, both Roberts and Gordon, but I can also help the other side get a much better deal. So it's a very different way of thinking about negotiations. It's not just a tug of war, but it's essentially how do we both optimize the deals that we're getting. And for that, you have to talk, right? So if both sides said, well, just let's not put any cards on the table, let's ignore these negotiations, let's not even try to figure out how we best shuffle the value, both sides might actually leave quite a bit of value on the table. So that's the difference between compromising and integrating. And really that's the magic of negotiations, is how do you figure out what's important to them, give them what they want if it's cheap for you, and then you ask for something else in return. Okay, I wanted for 5 minutes, just put you back into breakout rooms with your partner. So just now that we've turned those cards around, right? So you've seen, here's the value. Maybe someone feels terrible because they were just sandbagged, or maybe someone wants to revisit the strategies that they used. Also, you have like a sense of like what was actually happening in terms of these issues. Just a few questions to consider. How did you start the conversation, right? Did someone come in maybe too extreme that killed the conversation? How did you go through some of these issues? Was it one at a time, which probably made it a bit harder to negotiate? Or did you try to integrate and work in bundles? And what was the information that you uncovered? Did you try and figure out, well, what are the things that matter to the other side? And then also, how did you balance figuring out what matters to the other side versus making sure that you get some of that bigger pie for yourself? So just, let's see if we can open the breakout rooms again, 5 minutes. That's what I meant earlier with, that's the benefit that you have here, right? So you can get feedback from the other side that you don't get in the real world. See you in 5 minutes. Or 7. Okay. Welcome back. This was a short debrief, but I know that some of you have already talked about this a little bit before in the sessions. Is there anything that came up in your conversations that you want to share? Anything that you thought was interesting in terms of the feedback that people gave? Something that came up maybe was surprising? Yeah, Ephraim and then Donald.
Yeah, say how you doing? So one thing that came up that was interesting is like I kind of like jumped out the window. And I just jumped the gun, I should say. And I say that to say this, right? My partner pretty much we kind of wanted the same things, or I led with what was the top 2 most important things, and I did it inadvertently, but we still was able to come to a common ground, and then he didn't feel like he was cheated. So that was good. That was good. And I don't know, it's funny because it's like I used to sell cars, and one thing was important to me is just like I just remember, I used to sell cars, and when I used to sell cars, it's just like I never wanted to cheat somebody, right? I never want someone to get buyer's remorse because I know how that feels, and it really hurts really, really bad. So that's it. So.
And I think that it's important, right? So essentially, you want to have your own ethical and moral compass. So some people say, I'm perfectly fine sandbagging and I'm willing to take the risk. And other people say, that's just not who I am. And I think selling cars is one of the very few instances where you might never see that person again. But in most cases, it's such a small world. Sometimes you kind of cheat someone once and trust is broken pretty much forever, right? And that might just ruin the relationship with the other side, but also quickly kind of penetrates through the network. And because people talk, and it might come back to you at some point. So I think one is like really knowing of like who's the person that you want to be as a negotiator, and then also being aware that if you're playing dirty, that might just ruin a deal right now, but it also might come back to you at a later point in time. Donald and Sandra, and then I'm gonna wrap this up. So that
one thing that I never really considered was, about what you mentioned about the joint gain and negotiating with the joint gains, and then both people win, like the company wins, the employee wins and gets the most benefit out of the negotiation. But so I'm really glad you said that. I'm going to look up some more information on that, on how to discover what the company really wants, and see, try to align with that the best way possible now.
And I'm gonna say,
instead of like going into it like instead of going into it like, hey, they're just trying to get the best deal to make the most money, like just try to get away from that kind of mindset and get into like, how can we both benefit from this? How can we come up with a great compromise that we both can benefit, the maximum potential.
The book that I recommend, I'm going to put it in the chat, is called Getting to Yes. So they talk a lot about this style of negotiation, and it's very much differs from how we typically think of negotiation, right? So it also takes time to get used to that. And the best ways, and I'm going to say something a little bit in a second, is to essentially ask questions, right? And come in and say like, look, tell me what's important to you in this negotiation. Doesn't mean that I want you to put everything on the table at once, but just asking questions, right? Oftentimes we think of negotiations, well, it's just I just need to convince you and I need to be persuasive and I need to be charming. What you really want to be in negotiations is a really good listener, right? You want to figure out what's important to the other side and how do I give it to them in a way that I can ask for something else in return. So it really flips the script a little bit. Okay, Sandra, and then I'm going to wrap up.
With the sandbagging thing, in my view, when the information was offered to me, it was this gives me some wiggle room, right? But being fair-minded, I'm not trying to insult this person into the ground and take, everything for the corporation. I mean, I got 61 or 62% deal. But I mean, asking questions definitely important. We didn't in our documentation have much detail on each other, so I didn't know if he had a family, if he had health issues or anything like that. So definitely trying to ask more questions and looking in terms of the metrics that you provided. I didn't really even look at them like that, and I can see how consulting that and having an idea of the whole deal, the whole pie, and how we can divide it up in a way that's fair and equitable.
And what I'm going to share, because I'm going to share a document with you after the session, because essentially what happened in this case is I gave you the points, right? I told you, here's how many points you get if you get this healthcare plan. Here's how many points you get if you agree to this. In the real world, you essentially have to come up with a scoring sheet like that for yourself. And it's really, really helpful to do that, because otherwise, essentially what happens is that we very quickly focus on the things that are easily quantifiable, right? So I'm going to run 5 minutes over. I'm sorry, but I promise it's not going to be more than 5. And so if you don't have a scoring sheet, you just focus on salary, because it's easy to say that 10,000 more is better than 10,000 less, right? It doesn't really, it's much harder to say, well, how much does it actually mean to me to live in New York compared to Boston? So I'm going to share with you an exercise, which is essentially allowing you to score your own deals and think through some of the negotiations that you have in a way that makes it comparable, right? Saying, okay, if I make a concession on salary, here's what I get if I'm able to live in New York, or if I get more vacation time to spend with my family, right? Because otherwise it's very hard to compare. Am I willing to give up $2,000 for like 2 more days with my family? Maybe yes, maybe not, but you have to figure it out for yourself. Okay. Final stretch. If you have to go, don't worry about it. Totally understand. I just want to say a few more things and then end with a story. So let me go back to my slides. I lost a cursor here. Okay, so the one thing that I want to say is for these negotiations, right? If you really want to trade on these priorities and grow the pie and create value for both sides, you really need to be prepared. And that means both knowing your side. So you need to know what are your priorities. And the easiest way to do this, the way that I prefer personally, is to say, here's the have to haves and here's the nice to haves. The have to haves, that's where I'm going to stand my ground, right? So the have to haves, I'm really trying to not make a concession on. What I might be happy to make a concession on is a nice to have. If I can trade a nice to have for a have to have for myself, that's essentially what you want to aim for. But you also need to understand their side, right? So you need to figure out is like, okay, how do I satisfy one of their have to haves with a nice to have from my side so that they're more willing to reciprocate? And for that, asking questions is the best way. It's like really trying to figure out, okay, what is it that you care about? And just listening and asking questions more than actually talking. And then also kind of thinking about how you're going to respond to their questions, right? So they might ask you the same thing. What's your ethical code? How do you want to play this? And the idea, and this is just kind of to reiterate, is really this notion that instead of thinking about negotiations just as like, how do we slice the pie, right? How do I get some of it for myself and make sure that I'm not just handing it over to the other side? A lot of it has to do with creation. So how do you actually expand beyond like, oh, we're just talking about money? How do you fold in some of these other things that might allow you to deal with these integrative issues and make these smart trades? And then it really kind of moves a little bit away from what we think of positional bargaining, which is like, here's what I want. to interest based bargaining, which is really trying to understand, okay, why do they want it? Why is it important to them, right? If you think about healthcare, it's like, yes, you want something that I don't want. We want the opposite things. But if I understand why is it important to Roberts, and maybe I can solve it even in a way that makes it cheaper for me, right? It's like a way of figuring out what are their priorities and like, how do I solve their problem cheaply? And I want to finish with an example that I think is like really nice in terms of illustrating how understanding the perspective of the other side is something that is super critical in negotiation. So this is a story from Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 when he was running for president, and they were just like weeks away from the election, and they were trying to get more voters behind the campaign and by distributing these pamphlets. So there was like a pamphlet, stern presidential portrait, and a stirring speech, the Confession of Faith, inside. And just as they were about to distribute these pamphlets, they actually noticed this thing on the side that says Moffat Studio Chicago. So they figured out that the picture was actually copyrighted by Moffat Studio in Chicago. And now they were facing two really bad outcomes. Like one is we can use the unlicensed picture and might be liable for, I think it was like $1 per copy. So it was like, would have been like an insane amount. So they would have totally bankrupted the entire campaign. Or the second option was, well, we're not going to use the pamphlets at all, but that would have also hurt Roosevelt's chances of winning because it was like an essential part of what they were planning to do to get voters on their side. So the campaign workers were pretty desperate, and they approached the campaign manager, George Perkins, who I think worked at JP Morgan at the time. And he devised this like very smart plan. So here's the message that he sent to Moffat Studio Chicago. He said, we're planning to distribute millions of pamphlets with Roosevelt's picture on the cover. It's going to be great publicity for the studio whose photograph we used. How much will you pay us to use yours? Please respond immediately. So he essentially flipped it around and got the answer within like a few hours. Well, we've never done this before, but under the circumstances, we'd be pleased to offer you $250, right? So by stepping into his counterpart's shoes, he managed to turn around a situation that had two bad options. We're not using it, or we might be liable, into like an additional windfall of $250. So really thinking about negotiations means thinking about it from your side, but also very much from the perspective of the other side. And with that, thank you for letting me go over by 6 minutes. And it was a pleasure to be here. I hope it's somewhat useful and allows you to both feel more comfortable going through negotiations and then also getting better deals.
Sandra, thank you so much. Even though it was 6 minutes over, I feel like every minute was really, really worth it. By the way, everyone, I have sat through Sandra's classes a couple of times, and every time I sit in, I feel like I learned something new. So for those of you who are thinking of watching the recording again, please do, because you're always going to learn something new. And
like a lot of content that I threw at you.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you so much and enjoy your evening.
Yeah, and with that, everyone, I think this will be the last time I will be seeing you this term. So want to wish you the very best for all of your upcoming assignments. I know Tech Pathway still has a few more weeks to go. And between now and then, I know there's a lot of work, but also I want to wish everyone a really good Thanksgiving holiday. So with that, everyone, take care and have a good night.
Happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra.